This is Joe Posnanski. You're watching the Break It Down show.
My dog's barking in the background. I'm trying to mute her out. That's what happens. We got gardeners off schedule in the other yard, and I'm in the backyard in a tent recording. But hey, there's Dan. Hey Dan, I must have forgot to send you the link earlier. Dan McLaughlin.
Yes, you did.
Has written blogs for years. Of course, Joe, you're the legend. I mean, you are the top of the food chain in terms of sports writing. What haven't you done? Like, legitimately, that's my question. What haven't you done in sports writing that you'd like to do?
What haven't I done? Well, that's a good question. I've been lucky. There's not a whole lot that I haven't had the opportunity to do. Of course, I want to keep doing it, and I've got other books to write and other events to cover and things to do. But pretty much, I've gotten to cover stuff all over the world. It's been amazing. Really been an amazing run.
Dan, if you want to ask a couple questions, my dog's barking a lot. You want to drive for a moment here?
Yeah, well, and I will just note that we talked last time about Joe's book, which I did just finish recently. So it's epic length notwithstanding. It's very much a good read. So recommend that to everybody who's tuning in if they haven't already gotten it. So what? I mean, where do you see? Let's bounce this off because it's coming up soon. I mean, where do you see the Hall of Fame vote shaking out? I mean, what do you think is the mood out there for? Are we really going to get like 5 or 6 guys in? Are we going to get like 1 or 2?
We might not get any. I mean,
or 0. Yeah,
yeah, we might get 0 from what I'm seeing out there. I think the one and only guy, in my view, that I think is likely to get in is David Ortiz at this point. I'm seeing no real appetite for Bonds or Clemens in their final year, or Sosa. All of those guys are in their last year on the ballot, and I'm not seeing any movement on how people feel. I mean, there was sort of a theory out there that when they got to their last year on the ballot that a sizable number of people would come over and vote for them and get them in and just end the whole conversation. But I don't see that happening. I see sort of a cratering of support for Curt Schilling, who was so close 2 years ago and then obviously super close last year. But he's come out and said, don't vote for me. He's come out and said he doesn't even want to be on the ballot. And I think that's created some noise. And so I don't think he's going to get in. I don't think any of the players who are building support, like Scott Rowland or Todd Helton or some of those guys, I don't think they're not going to get there this year for sure. And we'll see if they'll ever get there. So I think David Ortiz and A-Rod is a no-go from the early signs. So I think at this point, when you're talking about the baseball writers ballot, I think it's David Ortiz or bust. I don't think there's anybody else that's going to get in.
Yeah, and there's certainly an irony to saying, well, we're not gonna let in anybody because of steroids. So here's David Ortiz.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, that irony was long ago broken. I mean, right? There have been several players who have been voted into the Hall of Fame who were either largely suspected or pretty much assumed to have been steroid users. And the thing is, it's a mess, right? I mean, it's just been a mess for years, and nobody really knows. Like, Bud Selig is in the Hall of Fame. Obviously, it's a different group of voters, but Bud Selig oversaw the whole era, and he's in the Hall of Fame. The managers who manage these players are in the Hall of Fame. But they're not. It's a very weird thing, and But here the one thing that I feel pretty good about is it's almost over, right? I mean, this is it. This is going to be Bonds and Clemens. I'm sure people will still be fighting about it forever, but this is the last December that we're gonna, or January now, that we're going to be just hearing people like, I'm voting for him, I'm not voting for him, whatever. They're off the ballot after this year, and it'll be in the hands of various committees, and we'll see if they have the appetite to get them in. I don't think they do, but it will be. that will be something interesting to watch.
And when we get to the various committees down the road, and we're talking McGuire, Sosa, Palmiero, Bonds, Clemens, Schilling, Vizquel, because obviously Vizquel's not ever going to get in with from the writers.
Talk about cratered support.
Right. Right. And all of a sudden you realize those committees are going to be bogged down for years with a glut of people and trying to sort that out.
No question. But here's the thing that's going to be very interesting. So McGuire has already come up on one of those committees. He was up 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, maybe. He was up in one of the committees, and he got literally 0 votes. He got so little support on the committee that he was dropped from the ballot the next time around. And I think that's a sign. To me, it's what's really interesting is people want to, and should, they'd be more than happy when people want to beat up on the Baseball Writers Association. That's nothing wrong with that. But people want to beat up on the BBWAA for not putting in Bonds and Clemens and those two in particular. And they're going to get closer on the BBWAA, I feel like, than they will ever get on a committee. I just don't think they're going to be able to put together a committee that's going to put those guys in. I mean, not in the foreseeable future. At some point, they'll probably have a quote unquote steroid committee where they're just going to basically want to pay tribute to that era of baseball, and maybe they'll all go in. I mean, there might be, you never know what's going to come down the pike. But for now, I just don't see any real momentum for those guys at all.
Dan?
Yeah, and if there's one lesson we've learned over time, it's that the biggest question of all in what the committees do is who's on the committees.
Yes, it's 100% right, and we've seen it. I mean, that not to in any way knock anybody who's gotten in, but there's no question that when Harold Baines got in, you looked at the makeup of the committee, and it was very, very nicely situated for Harold Baines, and good for him. I mean, there's nothing negative about that at all. Harold Baines was a terrific player, but there are many players who probably should be ahead of line of Harold Baines, but they didn't have their manager on the committee, their GM on the committee. It worked out very nicely for him. And it has not worked out that well for some other people. And I don't know, that's the other thing. Who is going to be on the Bonds or Clemens committee that's going to be their sort of massive supporter, right? Like who is going to get on one of these committees that's going to be like, yeah, it's going to be my singular goal to get Barry Bonds into the Hall of Fame. I don't know that person exists.
When you look at the other aspects of this too, at some point the baseball writers have to elect somebody into the Hall of Fame. I mean, there's 2 offers. If this year's going to be an offer in the recent past, and at some point, like, hey, you guys have a job, and turning in a blank ballot which somebody has done, is not, I don't think, being genuine to the role of what they're trying to do. And also, I want to add in this just to go further, so we don't have a bunch of questions from me, but that interesting article on Fangraphs comparing and contrasting Bobby Abreu and Ichiro, and you realize, and I think you said this before, and Dan, I believe you said this too, when you do a bunch of things well, you can be overlooked because you aren't as spectacular as someone like Ichiro. What are your thoughts on the responsibility of the baseball writers? And then slide over to Abreu, if you would.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's 2 different thoughts. I was actually taking a look here at who's coming up on the ballots to give you a sense. I don't think we're going to go over this year. I do think David Ortiz is going to get in. And then we can talk about the future after that. But look, I think the responsibility is to vote your conscience. I mean, I think that's what they're asking us to do. There are 400 and some writers who are voting, and they bring a lot of different elements to the table. Some are very much, it's just about baseball. That's why I'm here. It's the only reason I'm qualified to vote. There are others who say, no, you've got a responsibility to live up to the character clause that we're all presented with when we get the vote. There are those who are very generous, want to see a big Hall of Fame. I mean, I would put myself in that category where I really believe that the Hall of Fame is too small now. Not a lot too small. Not that I want to lower the standards. I just feel like there are a lot of players who are up to the standards who are not getting in. And then there are others who are like, no, the Hall of Fame is too big, that we should throw some of these guys out. So I definitely feel like, that's where the 75% comes in, right? You got to get 75% of all of these thoughts and opinions and differing, arguments and all that. 75% agreement is how you get into the Hall of Fame. That's the idea anyway. When it comes to Abreu, I think that's a great, he is a perfect example of what I've said many times, which is that if you do a lot of things well, you're underrated. And particularly a guy who did a lot of quiet things well, the way Abreu did. He walked so much, and you don't get a lot of glory for drawing a million walks, but he did. I mean, that's what he did. He was obviously fast, stole some bases, especially early in his career. He was a good defensive player for a while. And so, he's a guy that did, and he hit with power and ended for average. He did a lot of really good things. Well, I don't put him, I actually wrote a piece that will be running on my Substack at joeposnanski.com. Maybe later today or tomorrow. I've actually finished it. And it's a piece comparing Gary Sheffield to David Ortiz. And if you compare them as players, purely as players, I think you can make a very strong argument that Sheffield was the better player. I think you can make a very strong argument that Gary Sheffield was certainly as good a hitter as David Ortiz and maybe a better hitter. And then he did other things that Ortiz didn't do. He was a much better base runner. He wasn't a great fielder, but he did play the field. So you could really make a strong argument. But I think when it comes to the Hall of Fame, David Ortiz, just his impact on the game was so much larger than Gary Sheffield's or almost anybody else's. It's the Koufax argument to me, where it's like, if you have that gigantic an impact on the game, you're a Hall of Famer regardless of the other things. And I think Ichiro was a gigantic impact on the game in so many ways, not only as the first great Japanese position player in the major leagues, not only as an MVP, the way he played, the style he played, all of those things, but simply add together what he did in Japan and what he did here. And it's unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented. So I definitely see a very strong Hall of Fame case for Abreu, but to me, he's not Ichiro. Like I don't put him in that same category.
Yeah, I mean Ortiz clearly, very much like Mariano Rivera, is a guy where you cannot even begin to discuss his case without the postseason, without the huge impact of the postseason.
It's 100% right. Yeah, I mean, here's how I described it in the piece that I wrote. I said, think of the history of baseball. Think of a book, a gigantic book like the Baseball 100. Think of a gigantic history of baseball. Now turn to the back and look at the index and see how often that player is named in the index, right? And if you're Gary Sheffield, you're probably in the index. He was a dominant player. He was an intimidating player. Everybody remembers the great bat shake, the way he would shake his bat behind him. But he's probably not in there that much. You have David Ortiz. There's a whole column of David Ortiz, right? There's the multiple home runs and game-winning hits he hit to break the curse with the Red Sox. There's the Boston Marathon bombing speech. There's the World Series where basically you couldn't get him out, on and on and on and on. I mean, the impact he had on the game is so much bigger than a guy who I think was a great player like Gary Sheffield. So yeah, I think it is something where, yes, we want to put the very, very best players in the Hall of Fame, but we cannot overlook the postseason. We cannot overlook the impact these guys had on the game. And I think the Hall of Fame needs to celebrate that. And I truly believe that in some cases that means putting in somebody who maybe his career numbers don't necessarily say Hall of Fame. Like I think a guy like Dale Murphy, who had just an enormous impact on the game, an enormous impact on the South, particularly in baseball in the South. And some of it was his doing, some of it was Ted Turner's doing, right? I mean, it's a multiple thing. But a guy like Fernando Valenzuela, whose career numbers might not stack up, but what an impact he had on the Latino community and bringing Latino fans to baseball and so on and so on. I just feel like that sometimes we get, and I'm guilty as anybody of this, sometimes we get too bogged down in, okay, was this player, 1% better than that player? And is that the difference maker? And I think that the impact they have on the game has to play a major role in this.
When we look at someone like David Ortiz, he gets in partly because he's a really nice guy. He's likable, and Schilling gets not in because he's a dick, and it goes from there. One of the things that always struck me in that era of the Red Sox was that the team was super fantastic. Johnny Damon is there. Veritek is there. These guys are getting on base all the time.
Right.
And I don't believe that Sammy Sosa requires any protection in the lineup. He is the protection. Barry Bonds was the protection. Benito Santiago cannot protect Barry Bonds. So when you have Ramirez and Ortiz batting back to back, I mean, that helps your Hall of Fame chances if you've got all these people on base all the time. And it doesn't take a thing away from Big Papi, but he was very fortunate to play where he did. If he'd stayed in Minnesota, would he be a Hall of Fame player? Because he sure didn't look like one when he left.
No, he really didn't. And I don't know what the impact was. Look, there's a lot of good things that happened to David Ortiz, including playing Fenway Park. Fenway Park, it was a great park for him. He was an opposite field, left-handed hitter. That's why he had more than 600 doubles in his career, right? He just banged a million shots off of the wall. It was just but look, he's a great, great player. Manny Ramirez is one of the greatest hitters I've ever seen, but those two together, it worked beautifully, of course. But I mean, that's the argument of Gehrig and Ruth, right? I mean, how much better did Gehrig make Ruth? How much better did Ruth make Gehrig? That's the thing about baseball. It's not an even playing field when it comes to what we remember. I mean, if Gary Sheffield had been in Boston at that exact time, would he have been the iconic figure? Maybe he would have. I mean, as a player, I don't think he would have as a personality. I mean, Ortiz is his own thing, but you can always ask, how good would Ernie Banks have been if he'd been on the Yankees where they're in the World Series every year? And those are great questions. But at the end of the day, history is history, and what Ortiz did is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, if you had asked 100 baseball fans in 2004, who's the bigger star here? I mean, pretty much everybody would have said Manny. Over Ortiz.
Absolutely. I think Manny was as big a star as there was in the game. And by the way, if I had to choose one at bat, one hitter, I'm choosing Manny over Ortiz. No offense to David Ortiz. Yeah, Ortiz came through in the biggest moments in an incredible way, but Manny was otherworldly as a hitter. Just a completely, he was a hitting genius. I mean, he really truly was, and he buried himself as a Hall of Fame candidate. We all know, but he was an absolute hitting savant.
Have we learned, at least as writers, have we learned that the eye test is a pretty crappy test? I mean, Jim Rice gets in because he was terrifying. I also remember Gary Sheffield, and if you threw a strike, he was going to punish it. If he didn't throw a strike, he'd be on first base. Kind of like 80% of what Barry Bonds was, right? I mean, as dangerous as you could be. And Dewey Evans is not in. So, how do we deal with this eye test thing? We're like, okay, some guys clearly are far and above, but Greinke has more, if we're going to use WAR, Greinke has more WAR than Verlander, than I think even Jeter, right? And Jeter is not only sails in, but everybody votes for it, right? And so what about this eye test stuff? And by the way, Rafael Palmeiro has as much WAR as Jeter as well. So it's really, I don't know about the eye test.
Well, the eye test is the problem is that there's multiple eye tests now, right? There's the eye test when it comes to baseball. There's the eye test because did they use steroids or didn't they use steroids? You're guessing, and that's a whole other eye test. I feel like with most answers with baseball, to me, there's got to be a way to blend the two things. So I think if it's just about the stats and the numbers, I think you miss a very, very big part of the picture. if you don't incorporate the stats and the numbers and the analytics, you're missing a very big part of the picture. So to me, it really is about blending the two. I think Derek Jeter is one of the greatest players ever. I also think Derek Jeter was not a good defensive shortstop, and I think that's the numbers say just how true that is. That doesn't, to me, take away that he's a great Hall of Fame player. But I wouldn't necessarily use his WAR to compare it to somebody else. Like, I just don't, he was a unique individual. I mean, his WAR is lower than expected because he was not a good defensive shortstop. And he played shortstop for many, many years and basically wrecked his WAR with by playing shortstop for so many years. But at the same time, like, you look just at his offense, just at his base running, just at every other element of his game, his leadership, you can't even quantify. He's an all-timer. He's an absolute all-timer. So I do think that it's finding that middle ground and saying, all right, look, Derek Jeter's a Hall of Famer. He's not the greatest shortstop who ever lived, but he's a Hall of Famer. And using both that combination, I think, of what we see and feel about the player, and then putting some analytical perspective on it. I think that's the best way to go about it.
Yeah, and the eye test, it's funny what people do and don't think of as, this is sexy, right? Because like, if you go back to the 70s and 80s and you ask people like, well, who's got the best throwing arm in all of baseball? And like, I'm not quite old enough to remember Clemente. So for my lifetime, that's Dwight Evans, right? And like, if you ask people who's got the greatest curveball you have ever seen, right? And some people would say Koufax, but a whole lot of people would have said Bert Blyleven,
sure,
right? And yet somehow by the time those guys were done, or a few years after they were done, people were thinking of them in the same way as sort of Abreu, as these kind of guys who didn't do any one thing particularly excitingly well. It's like, did you watch them play?
It's a really great point. And it is what people perceive, right? Because having the best curveball, which I think you're right. I think most people would absolutely, in the 70s, in the 80s, and afterward, would have said Bert Blyleven. As good a curveball as anybody's ever thrown, is not as exciting as having the best fastball. It's not as exciting as having the split fingered fastball that destroys everybody, or the changeup that makes everybody look stupid. And it's just a little bit different, even though his curveball certainly made many, many people look stupid. It's just a different perception. And Dwight Evans, everybody knew how good a player he was. I mean, it's not like people didn't know Dwight Evans was a very good player, but that was what he was viewed. Yes, he had the great arm, but so did Dave Parker, and Dave Parker was more dynamic, right? So was Dave Winfield, and Dave Winfield was more dynamic. Even Reggie Jackson had this great arm, and he was more dynamic. And that was the idea. That was the thought. Dwight Evans was low batting average. Dwight Evans was a lot of walks. Dwight Evans was things that people in the 70s and 80s didn't really appreciate. And even now, we don't really appreciate. Somebody with a low batting average and a high on base percentage because of walks doesn't really excite people that much, and that's sort of, we're not getting rid of that. Batting average has taken a tremendous beating over the last 20 years, and yet it's still sort of the most dominant stat out there. So you're right. I mean, it really is how people perceive it.
One of the things that's interesting, I got on to, never mind that. I'm asking a different question. When you guys talk about doing a lot of things well, I think about Von Hayes. I'm not saying Von Hayes is a Hall of Famer,
right,
and he has a short career, I think, because of an injury. But there was a time there where he could be invisible, and you're like, what does that guy do poorly? I mean, nothing great, but man, what a dangerous player. But no one was ever going to say Von Hayes, even if he played another 10 years, he probably still wouldn't be known. Oh, and then I was going to bring up Adrian Beltre. I was on him early.
Yeah.
And it's like he started so early. I'd look on Bill James' favorite toy, and I'm like, I don't care if it says less than 1%. He started playing when he was 18. Like, he just, you're going to end up with 150 hits. And if he hadn't have gone to Texas, if he'd gone somewhere else and he just banged out a bunch of singles and doubles and 15 to 20 home runs a year, he still would have ended up with 3,000 hits because he just had the ability to start early and play for a long time. He's he's not so much a compiler, but he's also not a compiler.
Well, he's compiled for sure. He's got the 3,000 hits, but he's also got all the Gold Gloves, and he was such a fun player. He's going in. He'll be first ballot Hall of Famer. There's absolutely, I think, no doubt he'll be in the 95% range, I would bet.
When do you think Beltre became a no doubt about it Hall of Famer, though? What year was that? Because it was kind of a sudden transition.
It was. You're right. It was probably when he was closing in on 3,000 hits. Okay. I'll tell you, he's very different, but he reminds me of Greg Biggio. So Craig Biggio was a very, very, very good player for a long time and pretty much overlooked. I mean, everybody kind of knew he was a good player. He wasn't Jeff Bagwell. He was just, but then when he suddenly looked up and he's like, oh my gosh, he's going to get 3,000 hits. And like, oh, he's Hall of Famer. Like that 3,000 hits is still the one thing. You get there, you're probably in the Hall of Fame. I mean, everybody who has 3,000 hits who isn't either Pete Rose or a steroid person is in the Hall of Fame. And so that number still resonates. I think that did somewhat happen, not just that, he also, got the home runs and with Beltre, got the home runs and the Gold Gloves and everything else. But I think with him, it really is not only did people realize that, but now looking back, you realize, my gosh, he was an absolutely phenomenal player. And probably would have been noticed earlier if he'd been a shortstop instead of a third baseman. I mean, I think that's another thing that sort of holds him or held him back to some degree. And he was inconsistent. He played for different teams. Like there were a lot of things that broke up his career and made him a little bit harder to see. But by the end, everybody knew that this was one of the all-time greats.
That kind of brings me to a transition point I want to talk. And Dan, feel free to ask a question to back us up if we need to. But people often talk about eras. I wrote an email to you guys, both of you, about we talk about the integration era, but baseball's filled with eras. Yes. When Adrian Beltre was a young player, he had an appendectomy in the Dominican Republic. It did not go well. It didn't heal. It was an open wound, and that cratered probably 18 months of that season and the next season before he finally got healthy. Pre-antibiotics, pre-knee surgery, pre-microfracture thing, pre your dad allowing you to play baseball, pre-farming accidents. I mean, every era has its own nexus that you have to get through to be able to play. College baseball, it's notable that Garrick played baseball. They always say, oh, he played college baseball. But who else played college baseball and went to the pros after that? It wasn't a common thing like it is now, right? So when you look at eras, I don't know, what are your thoughts in general, both of you guys? What are your guys' thoughts on the different eras and when doors open and close? Because you wouldn't want to go from here back to Honus Wagner's days because it would be really hard, You couldn't. Oh, yeah. I mean, you could. Denny McLain would drink like 30 Pepsis a day. Can you imagine if you were that guy today? And
then throw 350 innings and then and gamble all night. Yeah, no, he was definitely a different time. Look, there are countless ways that you can look at different eras and in recent times, because you can look back and back in the pre-airplane day, right, when everything was by train. You can look back and when there were no lights, and everything was a day game, and so you can look at lots of different things. You can look at when it was one time zone, essentially, right? Like that baseball was essentially all right around the East Coast. So yeah, I mean, there are different ways that you can look at different eras, but I think in recent years there are very, very specific moments that stand out. And one is Tommy John surgery, right? Like pre and post Tommy John are just completely different eras. It's, before Tommy John, it was a survival game. And it was a survival game throwing 300 innings a year, or 250 innings a year. And you had to survive. And then after Tommy John surgery, leading up to sort of the Dennis Eckersley closer era, where suddenly relief pitchers, you didn't bring in a relief pitcher just when your pitcher was in trouble. You brought them in because that was their job. Their job was to get the ninth inning. Later, it was also to get the eighth inning. Later, it was also to get the seventh inning. And so that has built up. And that has completely changed the game. Both of those things have completely changed the game. So now what you have are max effort pitchers out there throwing as hard as they can for as long as they can last. And so, everybody's throwing 100 miles an hour. And then, then up comes the next guy who's throwing 100 miles an hour. And that's very different. You mentioned Danny McLain. Danny McLain played at a time where you finished the game. That was your job. And so you weren't going to throw 100 miles an hour in the first inning. Like that wasn't a good use of your time. So those to me are the biggest sort of more recent. Obviously, Ichiro brought in a whole new era, and even really before him, Japanese players coming into the game, that brought a completely different era in. Certainly, the explosion of great players to come out of the Dominican Republic, really starting sort of with Juan Marichal, but that era, then that era of great Dominican shortstops, completely changed the game. So there have been so many, and then the draft of the amateur draft, the international. Now there might be an international draft. All of these things have definitely played a huge role, and of course, maybe the biggest of all, pre and post free agency. So the game, there are so many different eras. The game, it's so funny because we want to believe as baseball fans that the game is timeless, and yet the reality is it is in constant flux and it is constantly changing much more than we think it is.
Yeah, I mean, statistically, the world of baseball today compared to the world of baseball in, say, the 1880s, it looks a lot more similar. It's obviously not similar in some ways. I mean, you could just look it up, and you don't have guys throwing 600 innings anymore. But it's much more identifiable, certainly, than say the NFL. If you go back to like the 50s, you don't even need to look at pictures of the players. You just look at the numbers, and you're like, this is a completely different game. And I think baseball, because baseball is this balance between the two, between hitting and pitching and fielding, and it's that nature of that balance. Even with all the changes in the game, it preserves an illusion of being something much more similar.
Yeah, that's 100% right. Well, I mean, the idea is that everything, all boats rise together, right? So the harder the pitchers throw, the better the hitters become, right? That the faster the players run to first base, the better the arms in the infield to throw them out on ground balls. Like the idea is that that there's a balance that is sort of keeping the game going, right? Like that no matter what happens. Now, is that balance permanent? Is there any guarantee that at some point the hitters are not going to become so fast that any ground ball they beat it out? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's definitely I thought last year, just along those lines, I thought last year I saw more hitters beat out routine ground balls than I've ever seen before, and it felt like, and even when they didn't beat it out, the plays were, an eyelash basically. And so I think some ways, the game, there's nothing is promised, I mean, you got to keep finding ways to keep the game in balance, so that it doesn't run away, as it has at times. In the late 60s, it really ran away where pitchers dominated the game. In the late 90s, it ran out of balance for various reasons, not just drugs that people talk about, but for various reasons, it really ran out of balance in behalf of the hitters. And so I do think that there's a, that to me is the responsibility of the people running the game, is to keep the game in balance. And it's not easy.
The other thing about the talent pool, I mean, obviously you've had the talent pool expand over time because you had the introduction of black players, you had the introduction then of international players, but at the same time you've had trends going in the opposite direction, right? I mean, certainly since the 60s, the baseball has been losing the recruiting war for black players in particular, but for a lot of athletes to the NFL and the NBA.
Yes.
And so there's a push-pull there. I mean, I think there is something, even though you can't identify today or any past era as the particular golden age. There is something to be said for the period of the 50s because you had, a fast-growing talent pool with the expansion of black players, you had you had a period before expansion of the league was catching up to that. You had a period before the NFL and the NBA were realistic competitors for talent. And then on top of that, you had, I think, maybe an unusually mature generation of ball players, because you had so many guys who'd been in the war, so many guys who had that, that Warren Spahn, Hank Bauer attitude of, tomorrow's ball game doesn't scare me all that much. I've seen worse.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think all that's right. I also think that it's stunning to look back and see how much trouble baseball was in the 50s. I mean, like the attendance was cratering, and eventually it led to, expanding west and all of that. So it is funny, because I do think there is a very powerful argument to be made. You look at the 50s, particularly the mid 50s, Yankees and Dodgers. It's Mickey Mantle and Yogi and Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and Roberto Clemente and Frank Robinson, and you got these guys going through the 50s. Then it can't get better than that. That's as good as it can get. And then even into the early 60s and mid 60s, and now it's Koufax and Drysdale and so many, Bob Gibson. I mean, it was really more pitcher dominated at the time, but still you had Yaz and Clemente and so many others. So, I think each era has its own thing selling it, but really when it comes to like sort of the popularity of the game, there's an argument to be made that the 70s, that's really when it was drawing the biggest numbers on television, when it was expanding the fastest. But then there's, being perfectly honest, there had never been better attendance than there was in the late 90s. In the middle of that PED era that we talk about, that's when they set all sorts of attendance records, when expansion was coming faster than anybody could keep up with, when new stadiums are getting built constantly. I mean, so I think every era does have its own argument for being, the goal. That's why I make that argument that baseball is the best it's ever been when you were 10 years old. And no matter what happens from that point on, it'll never be better than it was when you particularly were 10 years old.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for me, and I mean, I think we were all in the same general generational bracket of that, the period from the mid 70s to the late 80s of having been kind of the youth in the game. And yeah. I mean, look, in the late 80s, you look back to late 80s, early 90s, and you had teams like, Oakland and Toronto and Minnesota drawing 3 million fans.
Oh, it was crazy.
It's bizarre.
Yeah, absolutely.
Imagine that today.
No, it was absolutely great. And, meanwhile, the Dodgers always were drawing and you still always, you had all of the cool things. You had some version of the Dodgers Giants rivalry. You had some version of the Yankees Red Sox rivalry, but those were not the dominant teams of that time. The Dodgers obviously had 88, but it was the Reds, and it was the A's, and it was the Twins, and it was the Braves suddenly out of nowhere came up and just made this, super exciting thing. I mean, I've always thought in some ways, how can it get better than the 80s when you had 10 different winners of the World Series, right? Like literally every year of the 80s, some other team won the World Series. That was really, really a blast. And you had teams that have not been heard from since, like the Brewers are in the World Series. And I mean, it really, really was great. And that was where we grew up, right? That was the era. So then suddenly we get to the late 90s and it's like, oh, it's all about the money and the Yankees are dominating and suddenly you're like, it was better when I was younger. That's the heart of baseball, right?
Yeah, I mean, you had great competitive balance, and you had some teams in that era too. Like, I mean, you look at the 86 Mets, the 84 Tigers, the 81 Dodgers, where you're like, who would you say is the star of this team? There's like 6 or 8 different guys who had incredible careers, who were more or less in their prime when the team won the title. And so they're just incredibly, I mean, the 81 Dodgers, hardly any, was for a long time was I think the last major champion with no Hall of Famer on them. Right. But you had like 8 or 9 different guys on that team who you would be in a Hall of Fame conversation.
Oh, they were all very good. Yeah, I mean, look, that 81 Dodgers team is obviously weird because that was a strike season. So that whole season felt really off. But look at the '88 Dodgers. I mean,
There's nobody on that team.
Right, nobody. I mean, that was
Mickey Hatcher.
Right, your Hall of Famer on that team is Don Sutton, who I think was cut from the team 2/3 of the way into the season.
Right, so it's and there's no question that I like to look not only at who's going to the Hall of Fame, but who had a Hall of Fame season that year. And maybe it's Hershiser for sure, right? And you could make an argument that Hershiser has a Hall of Fame case. And it was Kirk Gibson who didn't even play. I mean, he had the one hit, the one moment in the World Series. So you had like this thing. But that Reds team is another one. That Reds team in '90 that beat the A's. That was the team that Costas got in trouble for saying like they were the worst. Maybe it was the Dodgers. I guess he was saying the '88 Dodgers were as bad a hitting team as had been in the World Series or something. But that Reds team was similar, and that Reds team had I think that Jose Rijo led that team with 12 wins or something. Like everything about that, and I love that. We don't really get that kind of. I guess we have. I guess we've gotten a couple of teams like that sort of came out of nowhere. And
Edwin Rosario just went Billy Hatcher on this last, NLCS and World Series. Like you couldn't get Billy Hatcher. I think he went like 8 for 11 or something like
crazy.
That.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
I want to add this in too because we're talking about all of these things from that era. We also opened up the weightlifting era, which I think begat the PED era. So Brian Downing, I remember it was Joe Garagiola in the Game of the Week with Vin. And they're like, oh, Brian Downing lifts weights. This is really going to affect his play. And Nolan Ryan was lifting weights. And that was pretty much it. Everybody else like, we don't lift weights because we don't want to get our bodies all stiff. And then that leads to supplements and that leads to inject, there's that. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up is I talked earlier about protection in the lineup. Barry Bonds doesn't need protection. He is the protection, like several batters away protection. Ricky Henderson is the only guy I've ever saw be protection on the base paths.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, and there was this myth that there were leadoff hitters like Ricky Henderson, and there really weren't. He was a one-of-a-kind thing, so we chased these fast guys. But really, he did so much more than that. And I remember they used to do like those screen cutaways. Vince Coleman for sure, Tim Raines for sure. But they'd be a mile off first base.
Oh, yeah.
And it would just be like, can they get back? And they always got back. And those guys were so disruptive in that era, and you had to throw over with authority. Okay, maybe 110 pitches today, but you had to throw over at almost full game speed to first base to try to catch those guys. And if you didn't, they'd just steal the bag.
Well, they were going. They were always going. I mean, you look at guys like Coleman particularly. I mean, he was always going. Like Vince Coleman didn't get on base that much. So, I mean, that was the one thing that hurt Vince Coleman. I mean, Ricky Henderson was always on base, and Tim Raines was always on base. But Vince Coleman, he hit for a low average and didn't walk. But when he got on, he was going, and that was so fun. I mean, look, I miss that. I miss the stolen base. I mean, we saw much more of it in the postseason last year, which I thought was great. But I miss it. It's a huge fun part of the game. The triple, huge fun part of the game. And I don't want to sound like some old fogey. I mean, I love baseball the way it is now, and for all of its flaws, it's to me the greatest game going. But yeah, I miss some of those things. I mean, I think baseball has moved away from some of those things for very smart reasons. I mean, you don't want to get caught on the bases, but what was more fun than watching Ricky Henderson at first? He's going to go, and you're trying to figure out how you're going to stop him.
Back to the era thing. I'm curious what you guys think about this. At some point, there was the last season when someone had to get a part-time job in the off season. Like it's been forever now that these guys, you don't come to get it. You're already into shape. You're just getting up to speed with the game. Mickey Mantle missed the most important part of the season because of an abscess on his hip. That just wouldn't happen today, right? And so if you took Willie Wilson and you put him in today's game, I believe he could be coached up to be an even more electric player. If you took Mike Trout and you brought him back to the 40s, would he still be good? I mean, going backwards is probably harder because would you even be there? Three-finger Mordecai Brown. When was the last guy in the big leagues that had a farm accident and made him Hall of Fame career? What about going back?
That doesn't help. No, I think about what it would be like. if Mike Trout went back to the 40s, they've never seen anything like a Mike Trout. Like they've never seen an athlete like Mike Trout. They've never seen somebody his size.
But they wouldn't have creatine in the grocery store though either.
Well, it would be a very
and he'd be wearing dress shoes with nails in them for
and he would be selling insurance in the off season and
right. Yeah.
You know, I mean that's one of my favorite photos just in general, not one specific photo, but one of my favorite genres of photos are like those early days of spring training in like the 40s and 50s. And you see a whole bunch of guys on the bench and they're all smoking and they're like they have pot bellies and they're just like, I got to work myself into shape. And they don't work themselves. Like it takes till July before any of them are really in actual shape.
They have towels around their neck like they're doing something with a towel, you know?
Yeah. Or their arms in ice buckets. I mean, it's just like it's a completely different thought process. And now, and it's funny because we still maintain so much of that era. Like, why is spring training 6 weeks, 8 weeks now? I mean, like they're all ready to go.
They're ready.
Like, it's ridiculous, but it's a leftover from that time when seriously the guy's like, look, I was selling shoes yesterday. I'll be at spring training tomorrow, and that's how things go. And you know, look, it's way better now. I mean, it's a much better situation, obviously. But it would be interesting to see. I think this is true in general in sports. We look like, for instance, at basketball, right? And in basketball, you're like, oh gosh, if Kevin Durant went back to the 50s, like they would think he was an alien. There's no 7-footer that can make jumpers or whatever. But here's the thing: if Kevin Durant grew up then, he wouldn't have been a 7-footer who could shoot jumpers. He would have been a 7-footer who could stand under the net and like dunk it, or like just, you know, that, and just stand up. He wouldn't use his left hand. He wouldn't know how to do any of these things, you know? So it really does depend on the era when you grow up. And you know, we talk about timeless players. I really do believe if you brought a Babe Ruth, a Lou Gehrig, a Jimmy Fox, a Hank Greenberg, if you brought them to today's era, they'd be great because they grow up in this. So you couldn't pull them right out of their time and put them in. They'd never even seen a slider. They wouldn't even know what it looked like. But if they grew up in this time, it'd be the same thing going backward. Like if Mike Trout had to grow up in that time, I think he'd be a great player. But if he had to go back to that time now, and he was like, well, what are these fields? These fields are a disaster, and we're on the train, and everybody's drinking, and it's like, you know, it would just be a very different experience for me, for sure.
Why are we at the Copacabana? We have a game tomorrow.
We have a game in 4 hours.
4 hours. We had a game. I missed it. I've been at Copa hanging out with Sinatra rather than going to the game.
How about all the fist fighting that used to happen in the game, after the game? You know, like nonsense. Like, hey, I'm paying you $30 million. I don't want you fighting anybody.
There's one of my favorite like highlights comes from like, was it 77? The 77 Royals Yankees. He's 77 or 78. And Brett comes flying into third base on triple, and he literally just pops up and punches Nettles. Just just no. Obviously, there was something happened or whatever, and they just start wailing on each other, and everybody, the bench is clear on this, and nobody got thrown out. It was just like, all right, yeah, sure, just you just go ahead and punch yourselves out, and then let's go back to playing baseball. A very different time.
Yeah, Dave Rosema like tore up his whole groin. He was black and blue from his knee to his shoulders, tearing his groin and doing a karate kick on the mound.
What about so one of the things we talked with Rob Neyer about the other day when Dan and I had him on is the committees and looking at the other leagues. Now that we know that the Negro League is a professional major league, we have to deal with Far East baseball. I mean, Sadar O and et cetera, right? Like we really can say about 5 names and then we lose track of like what happened over there. The
Sure.
Caribbean leagues, clearly the Cuban league must be a major league at some point.
Oh, yeah.
And we have to deal with that legacy, and not from a point of view of, I mean, necessarily like a lack of access, because there certainly was that, but also Japan's like, you can't have our guys.
Right.
And so it was just a different time. But if it is the Baseball Hall of Fame, is it the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame or is it the Baseball Hall of Fame?
What's interesting is it is officially the National Baseball Hall of Fame. It is an American Hall of Fame. I mean, it's American baseball, not American, obviously.
Right.
Many players from around the world in the Hall of Fame, but they played here, and so even the Negro Leagues and everything else still was based here. I am one of those people who would love to see Sadaharu O just as a starting point in the Hall of Fame, in our Hall of Fame. He's already very much in the Japanese Hall of Fame. I'm sure it's practically the whole Hall of Fame is given to him. But I'd love to see that. I would love to see them. But that's sort of a different thought process. Those guys are celebrated even in our National Baseball Hall of Fame. I mean, you can find stuff about Japanese baseball, about Cuban baseball, about generally Venezuelan baseball, all these other things. They just did a wonderful exhibit, Latino baseball exhibit, which really celebrated those players before they started playing in the major leagues. But as of right now, it is the National Baseball Hall of Fame, and I do think that is its spirit. I mean, there is an argument to be made. If you go to the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame, which is a wonderful place, by the way, there are Americans in it, but they're not Americans from what they did here. They're Americans who had a huge impact on Japanese baseball. So in some ways, there's a little bit of I don't know. I mean, it feels like maybe, we have our Hall of Fame. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know that the Japanese Baseball Hall of Fame wants us to really start putting Japanese players in. It feels like, maybe we should focus on our own league, I guess. I would love to see it. I'd love to see us expand the idea of what the Hall of Fame is. I'd love to see us put in people who have had significant impacts on the game who weren't necessarily players. Like, I would love to see the people who created the Topps baseball cards in the Hall of Fame. I would love to see, those kinds of contributors. I'd love to see more of those. And I would probably lean in that direction a little bit more than because, like I say, it's not as if I don't feel we should in any way denigrate how wonderful a place the Japanese Hall of Fame already is,
Yeah. And then there's other players that are kind of in front of us, or people from baseball that are right in front of our eyes, and we're not sure they're Hall of Famers yet because we don't we've turned starting pitchers into like F1 cars, and any damage at all and they're out of the game, and you're like, oh man, shoot, it's not like it used to be. People that I think that we'll have to look at really hard later on in the future, Dusty Baker, with Gil Hodges getting in, Dusty Baker all of a sudden becomes if not a borderline, a viable Hall of Famer. And what about Bob Kendrick? What are your thoughts there? He's never a player, but goodness gracious, how important, character clause, whatever you want to do, how important is he to baseball and keeping the Negro League history alive?
Yeah, well, I'm probably not the person to answer that, since Bob is basically my brother. So it's kind of hard. I couldn't love him more. I feel somewhat that way about Bill James. I feel like Bill.
Yes. I think Bill James is a Hall of Famer for
sure. We had that discussion with Rob as well.
Yeah, no, and I know Rob is a big supporter. There are several of us who would love to see Bill honored in the Hall of Fame. And I think he should be. I think his impact on the game is enormous, absolutely enormous. You mentioned Dusty, and I want to talk about Dusty for a second. I think Dusty is an absolute lock for the Baseball Hall of Fame. I think he's an absolute no-brainer. And what's held him back is he's not won the World Series as a manager. But he's, whatever he is, 8th, 9th now in wins. He's done it everywhere. Literally every team he's taken over. Yeah. Every team he's made better. Every team he's given them huge success. He's been to a couple of World Series. And he was a really terrific player as well. I mean, you look at that life, and it is. I mean, who's had a bigger? I mean, again, talking about impact, talking about that index of that baseball book. Dusty Baker's in there all over the place. The guy who invented the high five. He's the guy who was on deck when Henry Aaron hit the home run. I mean, he's everywhere. He's literally everywhere. And
next time wristbands come back into vogue, it'll be because of him again.
He's absolutely should be in the Hall of Fame in my book.
Yeah. I want to bring up one more thing, and we don't have to talk about it, but I think at some point we're going to be confronted with a reality with Trevor Bauer. that, and I will say this is Pete's position. It is more likely than not that Trevor Bauer will be on the Dodgers mound pitching this year. What we know about this case, it all went to a big shady place. We don't know. We've heard a lot of speculation. We talked about how the Dodgers don't want him there. That was months and months and months ago. The investigation was turned in. Well, it's almost 4.5 months. It'll be 5 months at the end of this month. 5 months for the DA to decide to press. This is not a cut and dry case. And I've written about this in my Medium. That's not a plug for that, but just in general, I've thought a lot about this. And everything that Trevor Bauer has said about, hey, this is not what it seems. We've got text messages. There's a money proposition. There's all kinds of things out there. Most of that has at least had some truth lent to it. And we had a judge in L.A. say things. I mean, she said a remarkable thing. What happens when the woman says yes? You have someone that comes back and says, I want more. So we don't know. This is not Ozuna taking his wife, getting mad and choking her, and having the police. This is different than that. This is not. What are your thoughts on what are we going to do with that? And I'm not justifying anybody's bad behavior, not his, not hers, not anybody's, of course, right? But we have this reality of this may not be what it seems. And then when you look at Major League Baseball players, I know a lot of professional athletes, those guys don't want for sexual deviance in their clubhouses, right? And so when he stands there and goes, now what do you guys all have to say to me? Luis Polonia, who went after the underage girls. I mean, how many underage? I mean, there's such a mess with this. What are your thoughts, Joe and Dan?
Well, so let me say a couple things on that. One is I must admit I have not followed very closely his case. To me, it was out of sight, out of mind, and it was obviously very when the reports first came out, they're obviously very ugly, and it didn't seem like there was much wiggle room there, and so I'd be the first to say I've not followed the case, and I think that there is if he is cleared, if everything is sort of worked out, I mean, look, this is of course he should have the opportunity to keep going. But the question becomes when is a player no longer of value to a team, right? Like that's where it gets to be really hard. And Trevor Bauer, we know what a pitcher he can be. It was, to me, very, very surprising when the Dodgers signed him in the first place. It didn't feel like that was a Dodger-type signing. They were coming off a World Series. It didn't feel like that was what they needed. It didn't feel like that was the right way to go. Regardless of all of this stuff, he's always been an incredibly controversial figure, somebody who is always stirring. And again, when I remember when the Chicago White Sox paid a huge amount of money for Albert Bell. And my thought on it was, okay, well, what you're saying, regardless of how you feel about Albert Bell, what you're saying is what he does on the field outweighs every other element. I mean, he's not going to bring in any new fans. He's not going to make your clubhouse a better place to be. He's not going to do anything. But if he hits enough, then it's worth it. And it's worth whatever, $18 million or whatever they paid for. I think then you have to make the same calculations with Trevor Bauer, assuming that all the other stuff gets cleared up, which is obviously a big assumption still. But assuming that, is Trevor Bauer worth it? That's a very difficult question. And is he worth it for the Dodgers, who are obviously a team that can make other choices? It's not like he's their star that they have to have. I don't know. I like I say, I think it's look, we might not get any baseball, right? We're still trying to figure out what the heck this lockout's going to be. But yeah, I do not sense the appetite with the Dodgers to bring Trevor Bauer back, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
Yeah, well, and I think as an economic proposition, I think guys like him are worth it the most to the team that is most kind of hungry to win and can see him as the difference between winning and losing. I mean, look, let's without getting on a political tangent, I mean, that's why was Bill Clinton valuable to the Democrats when he was? Why was Donald Trump valuable to the Republicans when he was? Because they came along right at the point where their party was like, man, we're hungry for a win, and this guy got them there, and that makes such a difference. And I think. But I mean, I wrote about the Bauer case, actually riffing off of what Pete wrote, and it really is. It's. I mean, part of it is, if how Pete has described the case is right, and maybe it is, and we don't know all the evidence yet, but that this is something dark and immoral, but consensual. And that opens some rabbit holes we don't necessarily want opened. And I think it is also downstream of the general problem of, if we had, like with sexual violence, domestic violence, if we had more trust in our, the government, the law enforcement system to deal with this stuff. This is baseball organization. Professional sports teams aren't supposed to be in the job of policing this stuff in the first place. And yet they've kind of found themselves in a position where they have to be sort of moral censors of things happening off the field that have nothing at all to do with the game. Just because there's kind of a lack of social trust and faith that the institutions of the law are going to deal with them.
It's a great point. It's a really great point. I mean, there's no question that organizations are often said, okay, well, that person is figured out some way or another, they're cleared on legally, but you guys, we're going to count on you guys to go ahead and make the official judgment about whether they can play or should play, or are your team or not your team. But I do think with Bauer, look, somebody's going to, if assuming he does get cleared, assuming that he can still pitch at the highest level, somebody's going to pitch him. Somebody will say, hey, this guy deserves another chance. And, what he does in his private life, as long as it's legal and whatever, it's his business. Somebody's going to do that. I just don't think it's the Dodgers. The Dodgers don't have to. And that's why, again, I was surprised they signed him in the first place. But they don't have to. But I think another team will feel like I need an answer here. We're one player away. There's always one team that's feels like they're one player away.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if the Mets should be that team, actually.
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. It's an interesting one.
Well, and maybe the Dodgers are that team because signing Kershaw is anytime you get that platelet-rich injection, you're basically like, we're trying not to have Tommy John. I know there's no damage to that ligament. I know it's totally fine.
Yeah.
But let's be honest. If they sign him, they know that as a good possibility that thing's going to completely snap or need to be wrapped or something. And all of a sudden, Trevor Bauer becomes, and that's contract. He has a lot of power. He has probably the most power of any player ever in that contract,
which is crazy. Like the Dodgers were so desperate. I just didn't get it. I just did not get it. Not only to give him all that money, but to give him all that power, as if they were desperate. They had already won the World Series, and with a million great young players to come, it made no sense to me.
Yeah.
And then you get into kind of the Albert Pujols problem, right? Of maybe it's better for the team to cut this guy or sit this guy, but then we're on the hook for the rest of the contract. Whereas maybe if we just send him out there and he's terrible, eventually he'll get tired of being bad at baseball and he'll retire. I mean, I think that really is kind of where the Angels got to be at a certain point with Pujols. So maybe this man's pride will cause him to retire and we won't have to keep paying him.
That was never going to happen. Ever going to happen.
It was too much money.
Too much.
And he likes playing the game too much.
He loves it.
He loves baseball.
He played winter ball, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
Will you put up Joe's book one more time for us, Dan? This Baseball 100 book, you guys, it is awesome. I've read the whole thing. Dan has been through it, and it's so readable. And it's it's vignette. So you just read about a player, and you just look. I'm going to tell you right now, Joe, you're a really good writer. You're a really good writer. You're so good at it, and you get so much detail that I never knew. And I used to read all those books as a kid, 100 funny baseball stories, all those things. And that stuff was all good, but your stuff is so incredible. That Baseball 100 book, man. And I'm looking forward to the NFL stuff that you're writing too. Go to his Substack for sure. Subscribe, joeposnanski.com. That's super easy. If you guys like baseball, if you like football, you like sports, you like the Browns, go and support Joe's work. Thank you so much, Joe. Anything in closing for us, Dan and or Joe?
I just appreciate you having me on. This is a blast, and hope we'll do this again.
We will. Dan?
Yep, same here.
All right, stand by.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.